Boots hit the wooden planks with the arrogant, heavy thud of men who believed they owned the earth. They were young, foolish, and carried shiny new revolvers they had never fired in anger. They strutted up to the weathered porch of a crumbling cabin on the edge of Oak Haven, demanding the frail man sitting in the rocking chair pack his bags and surrender his land. They thought they were evicting a helpless, forgotten grandfather standing in the way of a railroad spur. They didn't know they had just kicked a sleeping dragon. This is the true account of the last real gunslinger. Oak Haven, Texas, in the late summer of 1899, was a town desperately trying to forget its violent past. The mud streets had been paved over with cobblestones, the rowdy saloons replaced by respectable banks with polished brass fixtures, and the sheriff no longer carried a shotgun, preferring instead the civilized weight of a leather-bound ledger. The railroad had arrived 2 years prior, bringing with it a wave of Eastern money, bowler hats, and a suffocating blanket of the law. The wild frontier had been tamed, subdivided, and sold to the highest bidder. Jackson Cobb was the man doing most of the bidding. Cobb was a land baron of the new era, a man who preferred contracts to colts and intimidation through litigation rather than lead. His latest ambition was to build a secondary switching yard on the western edge of town, a project that required leveling a stretch of useless scrub brush hills. There was only one obstacle, a small, dilapidated homestead perched at the crest of the largest hill, occupied by an old man who possessed neither a signed deed nor the inclination to move. The old man was a fixture of the landscape, as weathered and silent as the ancient oak tree that shaded his slanted porch. No one in Oak Haven knew his name. The butcher called him Old Timer, the bank clerk referred to him as the Squatter, and the children simply called him the Hermit. He came into town once a month, leading a sway-backed mule to purchase coffee, flour, and pipe tobacco. He spoke only when spoken to, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like dry leaves scraping across a tombstone. His face was a map of deep ravines and sun-baked leather, framed by a shock of unkempt white hair and a ragged beard. His hands were gnarled with arthritis, trembling slightly as he handed over his tarnished coins. He was a relic, a ghost haunting a world that had moved on without him. On a blisteringly hot Tuesday afternoon, Cobb decided his patience had run its course. He dispatched 3 of his newly hired collection agents to evict the squatter. They were led by Thaddeus Boone, a 22-year-old hothead from Chicago who wore a tailored suit and carried a double-action Smith & Wesson he polished twice a day but had never aimed at another human being. Flanking him were Levi and Jebediah, 2 local brothers built like draft horses, heavy on muscle and entirely devoid of imagination. They rode their rented geldings up the winding dirt path, ignoring the no trespassing sign crudely carved into a fence post. The heat was oppressive, causing the cicadas to scream in a deafening chorus from the brush. As they crested the hill, the cabin came into view. It was a pathetic structure, the logs graying and warped, the roof patched with rusted tin. On the porch, sitting in a wooden rocking chair that creaked a rhythmic, mournful tune, sat the old man. He wore faded denim trousers and a collarless shirt stained with sweat. A battered straw hat was pulled low over his eyes. He was whittling a piece of pine with a pocket knife, his trembling hands moving with agonizing slowness. He did not look up as the 3 men dismounted, their boots kicking up clouds of dry earth. Thaddeus adjusted his collar, sweating profusely in his wool suit, and approached the porch with a swagger born of absolute ignorance. "You the occupant of this property?" he demanded, his voice ringing with forced authority. The rocking chair continued its slow creak-thud, creak-thud. A ribbon of pine shaving fell to the floorboards. The old man said nothing. Levi sneered, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt. "Deaf as a post, Thaddeus. Just drag him out." Thaddeus held up a gloved hand. He wanted to do this by the book, to feel the power of the paper in his breast pocket. He pulled out a folded document adorned with official-looking stamps. "I am representing Mr. Jackson Cobb," Thaddeus announced, stepping closer to the porch stairs. Then those... This land has been surveyed and claimed under the new Municipal Expansion Act. You have no legal title to this property. You are hereby ordered to vacate the premises by sundown, or we will be forced to remove you and your belongings by physical means. The cicadas continued their roar. The sun beat down mercilessly. The old man blew a puff of sawdust off his carving, slowly closed his pocket knife, and placed it on the small table next to him. Finally, he lifted his head. Beneath the brim of the straw hat, his eyes caught the light. They were not the milky, confused eyes of a senile grandfather. They were a piercing, crystalline blue, as cold and deep as a glacial lake. For a fraction of a second, Thaddeus felt a strange, icy knot form in the pit of his stomach, but his arrogance quickly smothered it. "Did you hear me, old man?" Thaddeus barked, stepping onto the first wooden stair. The board groaned under his weight. "Pack your bags." The old man's voice, when it finally broke the heavy silence, was quiet, but it carried an eerie resonance that cut right through the noise of the insects. "This is my porch," he said simply. "You are standing on it." "Not any more it ain't," Jebediah rumbled, moving to stand beside Thaddeus. He cracked his massive knuckles. "Mr. Cobb says it's his, so it's his." The old man reached out with a trembling hand and picked up a clay pipe from the table. He struck a match against the armrest of his chair, the sudden sulphurous flare illuminating his deeply lined face. He drew the flame into the bowl, exhaling a plume of sweet-smelling smoke. He seemed entirely unbothered by the three heavily armed men looming over him. "Jackson Cobb," the old man murmured, tasting the name as if it were a bad piece of meat. "A man who pays other men to do his sweating. I knew a lot of men like Jackson Cobb. They usually end up burying the men they hire." Thaddeus let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Are you threatening us, you decrepit old fool? Look at you. You can barely hold that pipe. I'm telling you one last time. Get off this porch, or we'll throw you off." The air around the cabin seemed to grow stagnant, the suffocating heat pressing down like a physical weight. The old man took another slow drag from his pipe. The trembling in his hands had inexplicably stopped. The rhythmic creaking of the rocking chair ceased entirely. He sat perfectly still, a statue of worn leather and faded denim. "When I was a younger man," the old man began, his voice taking on a hypnotic rhythmic cadence, "there were no pieces of paper with stamps on them out here. If a man wanted what belonged to another man, he didn't send a boy in a city suit to read a speech. He came himself. He looked the man in the eye, and he paid the iron price." Levi scoffed, unhooking the leather thong holding his revolver in its holster. Times have changed, Grandpa. The law is here now, and the law says you're trespassing." "The law," the old man repeated softly, blowing a smoke ring that drifted lazily toward the porch roof. "The law is a luxury built on top of a graveyard. It only works because people agree to follow it. Out here, on this hill, the law hasn't quite taken root yet." Thaddeus was losing his patience. The heat was ruining his suit, and the old man's strange demeanor was beginning to unnerve him, though he would never admit it to the brothers. He wanted this over with. He wanted a cold beer at the Oak Haven Saloon. "Enough of these campfire stories," Thaddeus snapped, taking another step up the stairs. He was now standing fully on the porch, looming over the seated man. "Levi, Jebediah, grab him, throw his junk in the dirt, and let's burn this shack to the ground, mister. Cobb won't care if the site is pre-cleared." Jebediah grinned, a wide, toothy smile that promised violence. He stepped heavily onto the porch, the rotting wood sagging beneath his heavy boots. He reached out with a hand the size of a dinner plate, intending to grab the old man by his collar and haul him into the yard. "I wouldn't do that, son," the old man said. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't shift his posture, but the absolute certainty in his tone caused Jebediah to hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Why not?" Jebediah grunted, his hand hovering inches from the old man's shirt. "Because," the old man said, his blue eyes locking onto Jebediah's with an intensity that burned, The moment you touch me, you forfeit your life, and your mother will have to weep over a closed casket. The sheer audacity of the threat, delivered by a frail man who looked like a strong wind, could snap him in half, hung in the sweltering air. For a moment, absolute silence reigned. Even the cicadas seemed to hold their breath. Then, Thaddeus laughed. It was a loud braying sound of genuine amusement. "Listen to him. He thinks he's a dime novel hero. Grab him, Jebediah. Let's see what this ghost can do." Jebediah's hesitation vanished, replaced by a surge of anger at being momentarily spooked by an old man. He lunged forward, his massive fingers closing around the collar of the old man's faded shirt. In that split second, the illusion of the frail, arthritic grandfather shattered completely. The transition was so instantaneous, so violently abrupt, that the human eye struggled to comprehend it. The old man didn't stand up. He didn't try to wrestle away. Instead, his right hand, the same hand that had been trembling while holding a pine stick a moment before, moved with a fluid, blinding speed that belonged to a predator striking from the shadows. He didn't draw from a holster on his hip. His hand shot beneath the folded wool blanket resting on his lap. There was a dull, metallic snick as a thumb caught a hammer. Jebediah didn't even have time to register the movement. He was violently thrown backward, lifted off his feet as a deafening roar shattered the afternoon stillness. A heavy .45 caliber slug took him dead center in the chest, the impact sounding like a baseball bat striking a side of beef. The massive man tumbled off the porch, crashing into the dust with a bone-jarring thud, a blossoming stain of crimson instantly soaking his shirt. The smoke from the black powder cartridge erupted over the porch, a thick, acrid cloud that smelled of sulfur and death. The illusion of civilized 1899 was instantly stripped away, replaced by the brutal, unforgiving reality of the old frontier. Time seemed to dilate, stretching into a surreal, agonizing slow motion for the two surviving enforcers. Levi, seeing his brother fall, let out a feral roar of anguish and rage. His hand slapped down on his holster, his fingers scrabbling for the wooden grip of his six-shooter. He was fast, a local brawler who had won a few drunken gunfights outside the saloons, but he was moving through molasses compared to the entity sitting in the rocking chair. Through the swirling gray smoke, the old man remained seated. He had produced an ancient, heavily worn Colt single-action army, the barrel shortened, the front sight filed off for a smoother draw. The bluing was completely gone, leaving only the dull silver sheen of bare steel. As Levi's gun cleared leather, the old man didn't aim down the sights. He didn't need to. Decades of muscle memory, forged in blood and survival, guided his hand. He simply pointed his arm and let his left hand fan the hammer in a blur of motion. Bang! The second shot tore through the air. Levi's gun discharged into the dirt near his own feet as his right shoulder exploded in a mist of red. The kinetic energy spun him around like a top, and he collapsed onto his knees, screaming in agony, his useless arm dangling limply at his side. Thaddeus Boone was completely frozen. He stood on the porch, a mere 3 feet away from the old man, his tailored suit now peppered with unburnt powder and tiny drops of Jebediah's blood. His expensive Smith & Wesson remained firmly tucked in his shoulder holster beneath his coat, his mind, conditioned by city streets and legal contracts, completely short-circuited. He couldn't process what had just happened. 2 seconds had passed. 2 bullets had been fired. One man was dead in the dirt, the other was bleeding out on his knees, and the old man was still sitting in the chair. The Colt was now leveled directly at Thaddeus's chest. The hammer was cocked back, the firing pin exposed, waiting to strike. A thin wisp of smoke curled lazily from the dark, cavernous muzzle. The old man's face was utterly devoid of emotion. There was no anger, no triumph, no fear. It was the face of a man performing a mundane chore, as natural to him as breathing. Thaddeus felt a warm wetness spreading down his trousers. His knees knocked together uncontrollably. He tried to speak, to beg, to invoke the law, but his throat was completely dry. All that came out was a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. "Keep your hands away from your coat, son," the old man said, his voice returning to that low, gravelly rasp. Thaddeus immediately raised his trembling hands high into the air, his eyes locked in absolute terror on the black hole of the revolver's muzzle. The old man slowly stood up from the rocking chair. He moved stiffly, his joints popping, the adrenaline beginning to fade, leaving behind the aching reality of his age. He stepped over Jebediah's motionless legs and approached Thaddeus. Up close, Thaddeus could smell him, a mixture of tobacco, old sweat, and the sharp metallic tang of gun oil. The old man reached out with his left hand, forcefully pulling open Thaddeus's suit coat to reveal the holster underneath. He expertly slid the shiny Smith & Wesson out of its leather home. The old man examined the weapon, his eyes narrowing. He turned it over, noting the custom pearl grips, carved with a very specific, intricate pattern of intertwining rattlesnakes. The old man's thumb traced the carving. A shadow crossed his face, a sudden dark memory rising from the depths of a history he had tried to bury. "Where did you get this?" the old man demanded. The cold indifference was gone, replaced by a sudden terrifying intensity. Thaddeus swallowed hard, his voice trembling. It was my father's. He gave it to me before he died." "Who was your father?" The gun in the old man's right hand didn't waver. "Elias!" Thaddeus choked out, tears of terror streaming down his face. "Elias Boone. They called him the Missouri Rattler." The old man stared at the young, terrified face before him. He saw the faint resemblance around the eyes. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound that carried the weight of countless ghosts. "The Missouri Rattler," the old man repeated softly. He looked out over the rolling hills of Oak Haven, seeing not the modern town, but a dusty street in Abilene, 30 years gone. "Your father was a fast man, but he was careless. He pulled on a stranger over a card game he was cheating at." Thaddeus stared, his mind struggling to connect the dots. You knew him?" "I didn't know him," the old man said, his icy blue eyes locking back onto Thaddeus. "I killed him." Thaddeus's breath hitched. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He was standing on an isolated porch, miles from the sheriff, completely at the mercy of a ghost from the deadliest era of the American frontier. A man who had killed his own infamous father without a second thought. The old man slowly lowered the hammer of his Colt. He tucked the weapon back beneath his coat. He then tossed Thaddeus's shiny revolver off the porch into the tall grass. "Pick up the bleeder," the old man commanded, gesturing with his head toward Levi, who was moaning in the dust. "Tie the dead one to his horse. You have 5 minutes to get off my property." Thaddeus practically fell off the porch in his haste to obey. He scrambled into the dirt, his expensive suit ruined, sobbing as he tried to haul the agonizingly heavy Levi to his feet. The old man turned and walked slowly back to his rocking chair. He sat down heavily, the wood creaking in protest. He picked up his pocket knife and the piece of pine. "When you get back to town," the old man called out, his voice cutting through Levi's groans and the jingle of horse tack, "you go find Jackson Cobb. You tell him the eviction notice is contested. You tell him if he wants this hill, he needs to come up here himself, and tell him to bring a casket." The old man began to whittle, a ribbon of pine falling to the floorboards. "Because the law hasn't reached this porch just yet." Chop. Jackson Cobb sat behind a massive mahogany desk, sipping a glass of imported Kentucky bourbon while reviewing the latest topographical surveys of Oak Haven. His office was a testament to the new century, featuring electric lighting, Persian rugs, and a heavy iron safe built directly into the floorboards. He was a man who measured success in miles of laid steel and dollars accrued. When the heavy oak doors to his office burst open, shattering the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, Cobb's first reaction was not concern, but profound irritation. Thaddeus Boone stumbled into the room, looking less like a sharp collection agent and more like a slaughterhouse worker who had survived a stampede. His expensive wool suit was torn, caked in yellow dust and stiff with large oxidized patches of Jebediah's blood. He collapsed into one of the velvet guest chairs, burying his face in his trembling hands, leaving streaks of grime across the upholstery. Cobb did not offer the young man a drink. He simply pulled a pocket watch from his vest, checked the time, and sighed. "I specifically asked for the property to be cleared by 3 o'clock, Thaddeus. E.H. Harriman's regional representatives are arriving by Friday to inspect the switching yard site. I cannot have them stepping over a geriatric squatter." "He's dead!" Thaddeus gasped, his voice cracking violently. "Jebediah is dead, shot right through the heart. Levi's arm is blown to pieces. I had to tie Jebediah to his horse. He bled all over the saddle." Cobb paused, his hand hovering over his bourbon glass. The annoyance in his eyes slowly hardened into a cold, calculating glare. "An old man in a rocking chair managed to kill a 200-pound enforcer and cripple his brother? Were you boys drunk, Thaddeus?" "You don't understand, Mr. Cobb," Thaddeus cried, finally looking up. His eyes were wide with a terror that had fully settled into his bones. "He didn't just shoot him. It happened so fast I couldn't even track his hand. He had a gun hidden under a blanket. Then he shot Levi before Levi could even clear his leather. He took my gun. He told me he killed my father in Abilene 30 years ago." From the darkened corner of the office, a match flared, illuminating a face that looked like it had been chiseled from granite and left out in the rain. Lucius Galt stepped forward, blowing out the match and dropping it into a brass spittoon. Galt was Cobb's true insurance policy, a man kept off the official payroll. He was a former senior operative for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a veteran of the bloody Homestead strike, and a man who had hunted train robbers across 3 territories. He wore a simple canvas duster over a dark suit, and 2 Colt new service revolvers hung from a perfectly balanced gun belt. "Say that again, boy," Galt commanded, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that commanded instant obedience. "Describe the old man's weapon." "Exactly." Thaddeus swallowed hard, intimidated by the scarred, ruthless Pinkerton. It was a Colt, single action, but the barrel was short, and there was no front sight. It was filed completely smooth, and the bluing was gone. Galt stepped closer, his boots making no sound on the Persian rug. "And how did he fire it? Did he aim down the barrel? Did he cock it with his thumb?" "No," Thaddeus whimpered, reliving the nightmare. "He just pointed it from the hip, and he used his other hand. He slapped the top of the gun, fanned it, 2 shots, less than 2 seconds. Cobb scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair. "It's a lucky shot by a desperate old fool. Galt, take a dozen of the rail workers, give them shotguns, go up that hill and drag that squatter down by his heels. I don't care if he comes down breathing or in a pine box." Galt did not look at his employer. His eyes remained fixed on Thaddeus. A slow, deeply unsettling realization was creeping over the former Pinkerton's face. The arrogance and boredom he usually carried were completely gone, replaced by a hyper-vigilant tension. "Elias Boone," Galt murmured, piecing the puzzle together aloud. "The Missouri Rattler. He was shot dead outside the Alamo Saloon in Abilene in 1871. Wild Bill Hickok was marshal then, but Hickok didn't pull the trigger. The man who shot your father was a drifter, a man with no name, carrying a slicked-down Colt. The papers called him the Phantom of Hays City for a few weeks, before he vanished into the territories." "A ghost story," Cobb interrupted impatiently. "I don't pay you to recite dime novels, Lucius. I pay you to clear land." Galt slowly turned his head to look at the land baron. "You don't pay me enough to walk up the front steps of that cabin, Jackson. If that old man is who I think he is one of the last true gunfighters left alive. The kind of man who survived the bloody years not by being lucky, but by being colder and faster than anyone else. He's been sitting up on that hill, watching the world turn soft, just waiting for someone to force his hand. Cobb slammed his fist on the desk. He is one man, and he must be 70 years old. You have an entire arsenal at your disposal. Age doesn't matter to a rattlesnake, Jackson. The venom is just as deadly, Galt replied coldly. He walked over to Cobb's liquor cabinet and poured himself a glass of whiskey, a liberty he had never taken before. He downed it in one swallow. But he is flesh and blood, and he's alone. We won't go in the daylight, and we won't walk up his front path to read him a warrant. Galt turned back to Thaddeus, his eyes narrowing. Did he say anything else, boy? Think carefully. Your life might depend on it. Thaddeus nodded frantically. He said to tell Mr. Cobb that the eviction is contested. He said if you want the hill, you have to come up yourself, and he said to bring a casket. A grim, humorless smile touched the corners of Galt's mouth. He's inviting a siege. He wants a war. Galt looked at Cobb. I need 6 men, not your rail workers. I need the hard boys you keep at the slaughterhouse, and I need kerosene, a lot of it. Cobb's anger subsided, replaced by a ruthless, pragmatic satisfaction. Burn him out. Let the fire clear the brush for the survey teams while you're at it. Galt nodded, checking the cylinders of his revolvers. He wants to live in the past. We'll give him a funeral pyre fit for a savage. Crimson streaks painted the Texas sky as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, taking the suffocating heat of the day with it. Up on the hill, the ancient oak tree cast long, skeletal shadows across the weathered porch of the cabin. The cicadas had ceased their screaming, giving way to the lonely, haunting call of a coyote in the distant brush. Inside the cabin, the old man was busy. He had not returned to his rocking chair after Thaddeus Boone scrambled away. He knew exactly what he had provoked. You don't send a beaten dog back to its master without expecting the master to return with a bigger pack. The interior of the cabin was Spartan, consisting of a single iron frame bed, a cast-iron stove, and a heavy wooden table. The old man moved with a deliberate, practiced efficiency. The arthritis that plagued his mornings had been completely burned away by the adrenaline that now hummed steadily in his veins. It was a familiar, intoxicating feeling. It was the feeling of being alive. He knelt beside the bed and pulled back a woven rag rug, revealing a false floorboard. He pried it up with his hunting knife, reaching into the dark cavity beneath. He pulled out a heavy canvas roll, tied with leather straps. He laid it gently on the wooden table and unrolled it, revealing his past. Alongside several boxes of .45 caliber ammunition was a Winchester Model 1873 lever-action rifle. Its walnut stock was battered and scarred, but the octagonal barrel was meticulously oiled and completely rust-free. Beside the rifle lay 3 sticks of dynamite, remnants from his brief, miserable stint in a Colorado silver mine 10 years prior, and a coil of slow-burning fuse. The old man began loading the Winchester, pressing the heavy brass cartridges through the loading gate with a rhythmic click-clack. As he worked, his mind drifted back to the dusty streets of Abilene. He remembered the smell of stale beer and unwashed bodies in the Alamo saloon. He remembered Elias Boone's arrogant sneer, the way the man's hand twitched toward his holster when he realized he'd been caught dealing off the bottom of the deck. The old man had tried to walk away. He always tried to walk away. But men like Elias Boone viewed a retreating back as an invitation to murder. He had turned, dropped low, and fired before Boone's gun had even cleared leather. It was a mathematical equation of survival, speed, angle, and absolute ruthlessness. He had spent the next 30 years trying to outrun the echoes of that gunshot, seeking anonymity on this useless scrub brush hill. But the new world, with its contracts and railroads, had finally caught up to him. He finished loading the rifle and set it against the table. Next, he took 3 empty mason jars, filled them with kerosene from his lantern supply, and stuffed torn strips of a flour sack into the tops, creating crude incendiary weapons. He knew how the modern lawmen and corporate thugs operated. They wouldn't ride up in the daytime for a fair fight. They would come in the dead of night, creeping through the tall grass, intending to set his roof ablaze and shoot him down like a rabid dog when he bolted from the smoke. The old man walked to the front window and peered through a crack in the warped shutters. The valley below was pitch black, save for the distant twinkling lights of Oakhaven. They think I'm waiting in the box, the old man whispered to the empty room. He gathered his Winchester, his modified Colt, the dynamite, and the mason jars, placing them into a heavy burlap sack. He did not barricade the front door. He did not board up the windows. Instead, he slipped out the back door, moving through the darkness with the silent, fluid grace of a ghost. 50 yards behind the cabin, the hill rose sharply into a jagged spine of limestone boulders and dense chaparral. It was an elevated position that offered a clear, unobstructed view of the cabin and the entire front yard. It was the perfect sniper's nest. The old man climbed the rocks, his breath coming slightly heavier now, his old joints protesting the steep incline. He found a natural indentation between 2 large boulders, completely concealed by a thick patch of mesquite brush. He laid the burlap sack down, retrieved the Winchester, and settled into the dirt. He checked the wind. A light breeze was blowing from the east, rustling the dry grass. He closed his eyes and slowed his breathing, settling into a state of hyper-awareness. He became one with the stone, the brush, and the night. 2 hours past midnight, the silence was finally broken. It wasn't a loud noise. It was the subtle snap of a dry twig, the soft shh of fabric brushing against sagebrush. Down in the darkness, at the base of the hill, shadows were detaching themselves from the tree line. The old man peered down the barrel of the Winchester, his thumb resting gently on the hammer. He counted them. 6 men. They were fanning out, moving in a wide semicircle to surround the cabin. They moved with discipline, confirming his suspicion that Jackson Cobb had sent professionals, not just drunken town brawlers. Through the gloom, the old man spotted the leader. The man was taller than the rest, wearing a long duster that billowed slightly in the night breeze. He was directing the others with silent hand signals. Lucius Galt had arrived. The old man watched as 2 of the shadows crept toward the front porch. He saw the faint, unmistakable gleam of glass bottles in their hands. They were preparing to throw the kerosene. The old man smiled, a thin, hard line in the darkness. He reached into his burlap sack and pulled out a stick of dynamite. He didn't bother with the long fuse. He cut it down to a mere 3 inches. Down below, Lucius Galt watched his men move into position. He felt a twinge of unease. It was too quiet. A man facing a siege usually made noise, boarding windows, shifting furniture, nervously coughing. The cabin was as silent as a tomb. Suddenly, Galt's instincts flared. He looked away from the cabin, his eyes scanning the dark, rocky ridge towering behind the structure. "Hold!" Galt hissed, raising his hand. But it was too late. From the high rocks, a tiny spark flared brilliantly against the night sky. For a split second, Galt saw the silhouette of the old man standing among the boulders, his arm pulling back. The spark sailed through the air in a high, deadly arc, plummeting directly toward the 2 men holding the kerosene jars on the front lawn. Galt barely had time to shout a warning before the night erupted into a blinding flash of yellow light and a concussive roar that shook the very foundations of the hill. Concussive force ripped through the night, shattering the tranquility of the Texas hills with a deafening roar. The stick of dynamite detonated merely 4 feet above the heads of the 2 hired men carrying the incendiaries. The explosion was a blinding sphere of yellow and white heat that violently displaced the air, sending a shock wave rolling down the slope. The concussive blast alone would have been enough to incapacitate them, but the true devastation came from their own cargo. The glass mason jars shattered instantly, aerosolizing the kerosene, just as the dynamite's fire reached them. The two men, Rufus and Cole, were instantly engulfed in a localized firestorm. They did not even have the breath to scream. The blast threw them backward like discarded rag dolls, their clothes turning into pillars of brilliant orange flame. They collapsed onto the dry, parched grass of the front yard, thrashing wildly, which only served to ignite the brush around them. Within seconds, the entire front perimeter of the cabin was bathed in a chaotic, flickering hellscape of burning grass and melting cloth. From his elevated perch among the limestone boulders, the old man remained as cold and motionless as the stone beneath him. The sudden illumination of the yard was exactly what he had calculated. The burning men and the spreading grass fire acted as giant flares, perfectly backlighting the remaining attackers who were crouching in the darkness just beyond the tree line. The blinding light ruined the night vision of Jackson Cobb's hired guns, leaving them completely disoriented, while the old man sat comfortably in the pitch-black shadows of the high ground. Chaos erupted among the surviving slaughterhouse boys. They were brutal men, accustomed to beating indebted gamblers in back alleys or intimidating unarmed farmers, but they had never faced military-grade explosives or a coordinated ambush. Panic set in immediately. "Where did that come from?" yelled Bo, a thick-necked enforcer, frantically pointing his shotgun toward the dark roof of the cabin. "He's inside! Shoot the cabin!" Bo stood up from behind a fallen log to level his weapon, making himself a perfect silhouette against the roaring grass fire. Up on the ridge, the old man smoothly settled the walnut stock of the Winchester into his shoulder. The worn metal of the lever action felt like an extension of his own arm. He ignored the frantic shouts echoing from the valley. He focused entirely on the front bead sight, aligning it perfectly with the center of Bo's chest. He exhaled slowly, letting the air completely leave his lungs, and applied a steady, gentle pressure to the trigger. The Winchester barked, a sharp cracking sound that cut cleanly through the roar of the flames. A heavy 200-grain piece of lead crossed the distance in a fraction of a second. It struck Bo dead center, the kinetic energy punching right through his thick woolen coat. Bo's shotgun discharged harmlessly into the sky as he was thrown backward, collapsing heavily into the dirt. Before Bo's body even settled on the ground, the old man's hand was already moving. He worked the lever action with a blinding mechanical fluidity, down and up, ejecting the spent brass casing and sliding a fresh cartridge into the chamber. The entire motion took less than half a second. He shifted his aim slightly to the left, where another man, Caleb, was scrambling on his hands and knees trying to find deeper cover. The Winchester cracked a second time. Caleb let out a sharp yelp as the bullet shattered his thigh bone, dropping him into the dirt where he writhed in agony, clutching his ruined leg. "Get down! He's not in the cabin. He's on the ridge." Lucius Galt's voice boomed over the chaos, carrying the absolute authority of a man who understood warfare. Galt had already thrown himself flat against the earth the moment the dynamite sparked. He realized instantly how thoroughly they had been outmaneuvered. The squatter hadn't just anticipated the attack. He had built a slaughter pen and invited them into it. "Emmett!" Galt shouted to the last uninjured man, who was trembling behind a large oak stump. "Give me covering fire! Empty your weapon at the rocks!" Poof. Emmett, terrified but desperate to survive, leaned out from behind the stump and began firing his revolver blindly toward the dark spine of the hill. He fanned the hammer frantically, sending 6 shots flying wildly into the night sky, completely missing the limestone boulders. The old man saw the muzzle flashes. He did not flinch as one of Emmett's stray bullets chipped a rock 3 feet above his head. He calmly worked the lever of the Winchester again, chambering his 3rd round. He waited for Emmett to stop firing to reload. The moment the panicked enforcer ducked back behind the stump to fumble with his cartridges, the old man aimed directly at the thickest part of the exposed wood. He didn't fire at the man, he fired at the cover. The heavy .45 caliber rifle slug slammed into the edge of the rotting oak stump, splintering the wood and sending a massive, jagged shard of timber flying backward. The makeshift shrapnel caught Emmett in the side of the head, dropping him instantly into the dirt, unconscious and bleeding heavily. 4 men were down. The entire engagement had lasted less than 45 seconds. The roaring of the grass fire began to subside as the dry fuel burned itself out, leaving behind a smoldering, glowing perimeter of ash around the cabin. The oppressive silence of the Texas night rushed back in to fill the void, broken only by the pitiful moans of Caleb, who was still clutching his shattered leg in the darkness. Up in the rocks, the old man slowly lowered the Winchester. The barrel was radiating intense heat. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. Survival was not a game to be won. It was a miserable chore to be completed. He knew the fight was not over. The leader, the tall man in the duster, was still unaccounted for. Down in the valley, Lucius Galt lay perfectly still, blending into the dark soil. He had shed his heavy canvas duster, knowing the pale fabric would make an easy target in the moonlight. He was down to his dark suit and his 2 holstered Colt New Service revolvers. His heart beat with a steady, controlled rhythm. Galt was a Pinkerton. He had hunted the James Younger gang. He had survived the violent railway strikes of Pennsylvania. He respected the lethal efficiency he had just witnessed. He is moving, Galt thought, calculating the old man's next tactical step. A static sniper is a dead sniper. He fired 3 times from that position. He won't be there when I look. Galt was right. The old man was already crawling away from his initial sniper nest. His aged joints screamed in protest, his knees scraping painfully against the jagged limestone, but he pushed the pain deep down into a locked compartment of his mind. He moved laterally across the ridge, seeking a higher outcrop that would give him an angle on the dark patch of brush where he had last seen Galt drop. Galt began his ascent. He moved with agonizing slowness, placing his hands and boots carefully to avoid snapping twigs or dislodging loose gravel. He used the remaining smoke from the yard fire as concealment, weaving his way up the steep incline of the hill, completely bypassing the cabin. He was hunting the hunter. 10 minutes passed in agonizing tension. The moon broke through the thick cover of clouds, casting pale skeletal light across the jagged rocks. The old man settled into a new crevice, bringing the Winchester up to scan the slope. He saw nothing. The brush was thick, casting deceptive shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Then his sharp ears caught the faintest sound, the microscopic grit of leather sliding against stone, merely 20 yards to his right. Galt had flanked him. The old man twisted his body, bringing the heavy rifle around, but the confined space between the boulders hindered the long barrel. Galt rose from behind a slab of limestone like a phantom, his double-action revolver already leveled. He didn't hesitate or attempt to take the old man alive. He pulled the trigger twice in rapid succession. The heavy bullets sparked violently against the rocks. The old man threw himself backward, but the space was too tight. The second bullet ricocheted off the limestone and tore through the flesh of the old man's left side, grazing his ribs. A sharp, searing pain erupted in his torso, stealing his breath. The impact knocked the Winchester from his grasp, sending it clattering down into the dark crevices of the rocks. The old man collapsed into the dirt, clutching his side, his fingers instantly coming away wet and slick. "It's over, old man." Galt's voice echoed among the boulders, cold and authoritative. He remained behind cover, unwilling to expose himself unnecessarily. "You're bleeding? You've lost your rifle. There is no shame in this. You fought like a demon." The old man gritted his teeth, forcing himself to breathe through the blinding pain. He reached beneath his coat, his right hand wrapping around the smooth, worn wooden grip of his heavily modified Colt single-action. "Jackson Cobb doesn't have enough money to buy this hill," the old man rasped, his voice bouncing off the stones, making it impossible for Galt to pinpoint his exact location. "Cobb is a fool," Galt called back, slowly inching around the edge of his cover, his gun raised. "I don't care about the land. I care about the bounty. I know who you are, the Phantom of Hayes City, the man who gunned down the Missouri Rattler. The Pinkertons have had a file on you for 3 decades. There's a price on your head in 4 states. A lot of men have tried to collect it," the old man replied. He reached into his burlap sack with his injured left hand and pulled out the last glass jar of kerosene. "They were boys, drunks, amateurs," Galt sneered, his confidence growing as he closed the distance. "I am none of those things. I am a professional." "A professional?" the old man murmured softly. He struck a match against the stone, the sudden flare hidden by his body. He touched the flame to the kerosene-soaked rag. "Then you should know better than to talk." The old man hurled the flaming jar over the rock directly toward Galt's voice. Galt saw the fiery projectile sailing through the air and cursed. He had to make a choice, hold his ground and be bathed in burning fuel, or break cover. Training dictated survival. Galt dove hard to his left, rolling across the open gravel to avoid the shattering jar. The kerosene erupted against the rocks, illuminating the small clearing with a harsh, flickering yellow light. For a fraction of a second, Galt was entirely exposed, lying on his side in the open dirt. The old man rose from the rocks like a specter of death. He ignored the agonizing pain tearing through his ribs. He didn't raise his Colt to eye level. He held it low, near his waist. Galt scrambled to bring his double-action revolver to bear, his finger tightening on the trigger. He was fast, astonishingly fast. But the old man was a creature of a different era. He was a survivor of a time when the margin of error was measured in fractions of an inch and milliseconds of time. Before Galt could fully depress the heavy trigger of his modern weapon, the old man's left hand slapped down violently against the exposed hammer of his Colt. Bang! The fanning motion was a blur. The heavy .45 caliber bullet caught Lucius Galt precisely beneath the chin, the upward trajectory shattering his jaw and severing his brainstem instantly. The Pinkerton's fingers spasmed, firing a round harmlessly into the dirt as his body went completely rigid, then collapsed limply into the gravel. The echoing crack of the gunshot faded, replaced only by the crackle of the small kerosene fire burning against the stones. The old man stood there for a long moment, the smoke curling lazily from the dark muzzle of his revolver. His chest heaved as he fought for air, the adrenaline slowly leaving his system, allowing the severe pain in his side to fully blossom. He looked down at the lifeless body of Lucius Galt, a man who had relied on modern tactics and double-action speed, only to be undone by the brutal, archaic mechanics of the old frontier. The old man slowly holstered his weapon. He pressed his hand hard against his wounded side, applying pressure to staunch the leaking wound. He looked out over the valley toward the distant twinkling lights of Oak Haven. Jackson Cobb had sent his best, and his best had died in the dirt. But the old man knew this was merely a reprieve. The modern world was a machine, and machines did not stop simply because one cog was broken. They would send more. They would send the army if they had to. He had survived the night, but the war for the hill had only just begun. Morning crawled over the eastern ridges of Oak Haven, painting the bruised sky in pale shades of lavender and cold gray. The fire in the front yard of the cabin had completely died out, leaving behind a wide black scar of scorched earth and the sickly sweet cloying scent of roasted meat. Up in the limestone rocks, the old man was engaged in the brutal necessary arithmetic of survival. He sat propped against a boulder, his shirt discarded, revealing a torso mapped with faded, jagged scars from a lifetime of violent disagreements. The fresh wound on his left side was a nasty weeping furrow where Lucius Galt's bullet had gouged away skin and muscle. It wasn't deep enough to hit vital organs, but it was bleeding steadily, and out here, an infection was just as lethal as a hangman's noose. He had retrieved his Winchester from the crevices and gathered his meager supplies. Using his hunting knife, he pried the lead bullet from a spare .45 cartridge and poured the black powder directly into the open, bloody trench on his ribs. He didn't hesitate. He struck a match and touched it to the powder. The flash was instantaneous and violently hot. The powder flared, searing the raw flesh and instantly sealing the ruptured blood vessels. The old man's jaw locked so tight his teeth threatened to crack, and a low, guttural groan vibrated in his chest. He rode the blinding wave of agony until it subsided into a dull, throbbing ache. He tied a torn strip of his flour sack tightly around his torso, donning his ruined shirt and his heavy coat. He was battered, he was aging, but he was alive. Down in the town of Oak Haven, Jackson Cobb was experiencing a very different kind of agony. He stood in the center of his lavish office, his bowler hat crushed in his hands, staring in absolute disbelief at the lone survivor of the night's expedition. Emmett had managed to stumble back into town just before dawn, holding a bloody rag to his splintered head. He had babbled incoherently about dynamite, hellfire, and a phantom in the rocks. "Galt is dead?" Cobb whispered, the color completely draining from his usually flushed, well-fed face. "Lucius Galt? You're telling me a Pinkerton agent and 5 armed men were slaughtered by one geriatric squatter?" "He ain't a man, Mr. Cobb," Emmett whimpered, shivering despite the morning warmth. "He's a demon. He set the hill on fire. He shot Bo dead in the dark. Galt went up into the rocks to flank him, and we just heard a shot. Then nothing. I ran, Mr. Cobb. I ain't going back up there." Cobb dismissed the broken thug with a wave of his hand, his mind racing. Panic, cold and sharp, began to take root in his chest. E.H. Harriman's railroad executives were due to arrive on the noon train. If they saw a war zone on the exact plot of land promised for their switching yard, the deal would evaporate. Millions of dollars in municipal bonds and private investments would vanish. Cobb would be ruined. He needed an overwhelming force. He needed the veil of absolute legitimacy. He reached for his telephone, a newly installed luxury, and cranked the handle to connect to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Wyatt Montgomery was a man who appreciated the quiet life. He had been elected on the promise of maintaining Oak Haven's new, civilized reputation. When Cobb pounded on his desk half an hour later, demanding a posse, Montgomery was extremely reluctant. "Jackson, you sent armed thugs to a man's property in the middle of the night," Montgomery argued, adjusting his spectacles. "What did you expect him to do? Invite them in for tea?" "He is a squatter, Wyatt, a dangerous lunatic." Cobb slammed his fist on the sheriff's ledger. "He murdered 6 men. 6! Are you going to let a mass murderer sit on that hill and thumb his nose at the law? I am a primary taxpayer in this county. I demand you ride up there and arrest him, and if he resists, you put him down." Montgomery sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew Cobb practically owned the town council. If he refused, his badge would be gone by sunset. "Fine, I'll deputize 20 men. We'll ride up there and serve a formal warrant. But I want him alive, Jackson. I won't have a slaughter on my conscience." By mid-morning, a massive posse of 25 heavily armed townsmen and deputies, led by Sheriff Montgomery, was riding slowly up the winding dirt path toward the squatter's hill. They approached with extreme caution, rifles drawn, sweating profusely in the rising heat. They found the scorched yard. They found the bodies of the slaughterhouse boys. They found the lifeless form of Lucius Galt up in the rocks. But they did not find the old man. The cabin was empty. The false floorboard was open. The sway-backed mule was gone from its lean-to. "He ran," Montgomery said, feeling a profound sense of relief. Saw the sun coming up, realized what he'd done, and bolted for the territories. Put out a telegraph to the marshals, but he's out of our jurisdiction now. Cobb, who had ridden up with the posse, let out a shaky breath, wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Good riddance. Bring the surveyor teams up immediately. I want this wreckage cleared before the noon train arrives." But Jackson Cobb, for all his business acumen, understood nothing of the old frontier. He assumed the old man fought like a cornered rat, striking only to escape. He didn't realize that a man who had survived the bloody cattle towns of the 1870s did not flee when his home was threatened. He neutralized the threat at its source. The noon train arrived at the Oak Haven station with a screech of iron brakes and a massive plume of white steam. The town was distracted, bustling with the arrival of Eastern money and the gossiping frenzy of the posse returning from the bloody hill. Jackson Cobb sat alone in his office, a fresh glass of bourbon in his hand. He was exhausted, but a triumphant smile played on his lips. The land was his. The squatter was gone. The executives were currently dining at the local hotel, entirely ignorant of the slaughter that had occurred just miles away. Cobb had won. He walked over to his massive floor safe, spinning the heavy brass dial. He needed the original municipal deeds to present to the executives. He pulled open the thick iron door, reaching for the stack of legal documents that represented his entire empire. Locking paper in an iron box, a low, gravelly voice rasped from the shadows behind him. Always seemed like a coward's way of holding on to something. Cobb froze, the blood turning to ice in his veins. He slowly turned around. Sitting in the plush velvet guest chair, perfectly relaxed, was the old man. He looked terrible. His coat was stained with fresh blood, his face was pale, and he smelled strongly of burnt powder and singed flesh. But his icy blue eyes were alert, and the heavily modified Colt single-action army rested casually on his knee, the dark muzzle pointed directly at Cobb's stomach. "How?" Cobb choked, stepping back against the heavy iron safe. "The posse, they went up the hill. You were gone." "I took the mule down the eastern ravine," the old man said softly. "Tied him up behind the butcher's shop. Walked right through your paved streets. Nobody looks at an old man, Cobb. They only look at the suits and the badges." Cobb raised his hands, his mind frantically searching for a way out. "Listen to me. You won. You killed Galt. You killed my men. You can have the hill. I'll draft a legal deed right now. It's yours. Just put the gun down." The old man shook his head slowly. "I don't want a piece of paper from you, Jackson, and I can't stay on that hill anymore. You saw to that. Once the blood hits the soil, the quiet is gone." "Then what do you want?" Cobb's voice was high-pitched, bordering on hysteria. "Money? I have cash in the safe, thousands of dollars. Take it all. Ride to Mexico. You'll live like a king." "When your boy came to my porch," the old man continued, completely ignoring the bribe, "he told me the law was here now. But you don't care about the law. You just use it as a shield to hide behind while you steal from people who can't fight back. You're no different than a rustler. You just wear a better hat." The old man slowly stood up, wincing slightly as his injured side pulled tight. He walked toward the desk. Cobb shrank back, pressing himself against the wall, expecting the thunder of the .45 and the burning bite of lead, but the old man didn't shoot him. He reached into his deep coat pocket and pulled out his 2 remaining sticks of dynamite. They were bound together with twine, the short fuses twisted into one. "You build your empire on these papers," the old man said, looking down into the open floor safe, filled with deeds, contracts, and municipal bonds. He struck a match on the edge of Cobb's mahogany desk. He touched it to the fuse. It sputtered, hissing aggressively, sending a tiny stream of sparks flying. The old man calmly dropped the bundled dynamite directly into the center of the iron safe, right on top of the legal documents. Cobb's eyes went wide with absolute, unadulterated horror. "No! My deeds! The railroad contracts! You can't!" "If you want them, Cobb," the old man said, turning toward the door. "You have about 10 seconds to reach in and grab them. I suggest you decide what you value more, your empire or your hands." The old man didn't look back. He walked out the heavy oak doors, stepping into the busy, sunlit street of Oak Haven. Inside the office, Cobb fell to his knees, staring into the safe. The fuse was burning rapidly, eating away the inches. He reached his hands in, desperate to grab the explosive, but his innate cowardice paralyzed him. He couldn't do it. He sobbed, pulling his hands back and scrambling away from the safe, curling into a fetal position behind his heavy desk. A muffled, heavy thump shook the entire building. The explosion was contained by the thick iron walls of the safe, channeling the destructive force inward and upward. A plume of thick gray smoke and thousands of tiny burning fragments of paper blew out of the safe, raining down over the Persian rugs like a strange apocalyptic snow. Jackson Cobb's empire was entirely reduced to ash in a matter of seconds. He had no legal claim to the hill, no municipal bonds to offer the railroad, and no future in Oak Haven. Outside, the old man untied his sway-backed mule from the hitching post behind the butcher's shop. He climbed slowly into the saddle, adjusting his battered straw hat against the glare of the midday sun. He rode west, away from the cobblestone streets, away from the railroad tracks, and away from the new century. He rode back into the sprawling, untamed wilderness of the deep frontier, carrying his ghosts and his slicked-down colt. He was a relic, a remnant of a violent, unforgiving era, and as he disappeared over the horizon, fading into the dust and the myth of the American West, the town of Oak Haven finally understood the true cost of progress. If you found yourself holding your breath during this gritty tale of the Wild West, hit that like button and let me know your favorite twist in the comments below. The frontier was a brutal place where the transition between the lawless past and civilized progress was often paid for in iron and ash. Stories like this remind us that you should never underestimate the quiet ones, especially if they have survived a violent era. Share this story with your friends who love historical dramas, intense standoffs, and legendary gunslingers who refuse to go quietly into the night. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another epic narrative.